events of the fading year, the death of Nelson Mandela, the resignation of the Pope, and the selection of his heir, plus a host of others, are said to have been announced first on the social networking site Facebook before radio and television aired them, thereby putting into severe risk the future of the newspaper industry, the oldest media form and source of information across the world. Months ago, Newsweek, one of the oldest and respected source of information in the world, went totally online as a news magazine and at the same time as a newspaper. The question most people ask today, how is the future of the newspaper industry? And one question which is equally of interest is that although there is a decline drastically somehow of the influence of the newspaper, most people still need the newspaper, including advertisers. Why? My guest today on Globewatch is the New York Commercials Director for Middle East and Africa, Walter Paice. Thanks very much for accepting our invitation. You are one but last guest of the year.
It's a pleasure to be here, Charles.
Tell me, the internet has increased the panoply of media choices greatly, weakening the newspaper as a primary source of news, an advantage already taken years back by television and radio. Today, the publication of classified information by whistleblowers, named them WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, is the only area where the newspaper hold monopoly. How crucial are people like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange in the survival of the newspaper industry?
Well, I suppose I speak as a reader of news to that question, which is, firstly, I'd say that WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden were not the only major stories of the last year, as you highlighted. And I think, you know, how you digest your news is down to the consumer, whether it is in a newspaper, whether it's online. That's down to the interests and desire of the consumer. So we, in the news industry, try to cater to that and deliver news on any platform that the consumer might need.
You are the commercials director for the Middle East and Africa at the
Correct.
New York Times. What does it take to occupy the position which you are occupying?
I think a zeal for good news, a degree of an adventurous spirit, partly because of my region is so broad and so diverse, and an interest in commercial advertising.
Commercial advertising, you know that in the Western world in particular, and more particularly in the United States of America and in Great Britain and Northern Ireland, there is a decline in the readership, or if you like, the circulation of newspapers, and that has to do with the amount of advert that people consume in the areas. How do you find and how do you see the newspaper industry in the Middle East and Africa where you work when it comes to advertorials?
Well, if I may, Charles, that's not quite correct. The decline, the precipitous decline, be it perceived or recorded in circulation for newspapers.
For the past years, it has dropped by some 2.2% according to some research organizations.
But your definition, it's that decline of circulation is also being met by an uptick in circulation digitally. So it's really about the change in consumption that's important.
I'm talking of the hard copy.
But this is the central point of this discussion, is really it's about changes in consumption habits.
Okay.
What I think has happened over, I suppose what you might define as the last 10 years since the millennium, is we've witnessed a rapid sea change in how consumers read their media. And this has been sort of catalyzed by sort of developments and competitiveness in mobile technology. You know, in Europe now, and you mentioned sort of Great Britain as an example, you know, America is even larger for this. Lots of people now read news on the move. So it's not so much about looking at platforms and their declines, but looking about and understanding consumption habits, which is important. In my region, in the Middle East and Africa, print news is still a very important staple of day-to-day life, and so it's still thriving. There's still lots of news magazines, newspapers, and they're still well supported by advertisers.
Why do you think that it is booming in this area, or is still in good health in this area, Middle East and Africa?
Well, as I said, I think it relates to consumption habits. I think, America, which is...
Is it because most of the countries are yet to have radio and television, and because the internet services are not the best, that is why the hard copy is still a hot cake?
I think that's partially to do with it, yes. I think, as media, as I mentioned, is going through an evolution, and that evolution is met at different speeds in different countries. Everyone in America seems to own an iPhone or a smartphone of some description, and so they have the privilege of being able to read their news on the move. It isn't so much about just getting it off social media, as you insinuated earlier, but rather more about just the options available, and that has broadened competitiveness in the market, and I think that's a good thing, to be honest.
Advertising or commercials is a broad-based topic. What specifically is your job as commercials director for Middle East and Africa? What kind of adverts do you target? Classified, or the traditional adverts, or the new forms? Well,
as you just said, it's very broad. I cover a range of clients ranging from corporates to government to anyone really who has an interest in communicating with the audience that the New York Times caters to, which is broad and as diverse as my region and beyond.
And that calls for special commercials skills, because you are in a very competitive market. What strategies are you using to lobby with corporations, government, institutions, independent bodies in this area, as you are working for an organization, the New York Times company, which runs so many newspapers and other products?
I'd certainly like my employers to think so anyway. I think it's about representing your product well and clearly, and ultimately my belief is that if you have a trusted product which has a clear track record of delivery, of quality, of integrity, which I believe the New York Times, amongst other peer news organizations, occupies that space. I think it's just a case of creating that familiarity and then understanding your clients' needs and their communications objectives.
And how do you do that? How do you communicate with them?
Well, by meeting and listening.
Listening.
That's the key, really. It's the understanding on both sides. It's my explaining to you what are the principal tenets that would help you in your communication strategy, and me understanding what are your principal aims, and then fitting those two together. And if one can, then there's your business. If not, then you move on.
What does a corporate body or a government stand to gain doing business of adverts with the New York Times, one of the most respected and known media companies in the world?
I think that would entirely depend on their objectives. We work in travel and tourism, which is obviously a huge area for many governments in encouraging visitors from around the world to visit their countries. We work with countries who are involved in bids, in raising awareness. It's we have such a broad portfolio of opportunities and products that it really depends entirely on what the needs are, and then we will look at how we can meet them best.
Which means that you need to have a clear distinction between journalism and the commercials department.
Absolutely.
How do you survive in that area? Because you are not only doing commercials, but at the same time, you practice journalism at the New York Times.
There's a fundamental divide between journalism and anything commercial related that has been maintained since the inception of the New York Times, and is a fundamental of journalistic ethics throughout news media, and that church and state divide has always been maintained. Well, to the peer news titles that I can speak of, very strictly, because that is what maintains our integrity as an organisation.
How is that practiced at the New York Times? Because this is a giant multinational, permit me use that expression, which at the same time has an editorial board, and that editorial board at times endorses candidates for elections. It's a common practice in American media corporations. How can you distinguish the independence of the journalists, the commercial department, and the board members who have to endorse a political a political party or a candidate for an election, for the credibility, the integrity, and the independence of the journalist to be guaranteed. If I want to work at the New York Times, what should I do?
Well, there I would have to speak again as a reader rather than as an employee of the New York Times, because, to be frank, I can't speak to the opinions of individual journalists that may or may not support, you know, electoral agendas. I don't, honestly, the way that you've structured that question, it doesn't actually relate to the way we actually write in the New York Times. The New York Times has a personality globally as a liberal newspaper. So if there's editorial that otherwise supports a liberal candidate, for example, in an election, that will be entirely down to the bent of that journalist and not related to a commercial gain that we could make.
I want to know from you the challenges you face in your area of operation.
Challenges. Well, I suppose it's about my principal goal within the Middle East and African region is raising awareness about the New York Times portfolio from a commercial standpoint. Editorially, it does that job perfectly itself, but from a business standpoint, my job is to work with a diverse array of clients across the Middle East region and in Africa, and here in Cameroon, for example, and create a greater understanding of the facility that we have to work with them, and that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of trust, and it takes the development of interpersonal relationships which are central to business development.
I am not a commercial professional. I am a journalist.
I would hope not.
And I want to know from you, what is the role, is paparazzi journalism a commercial policy, especially in the Western media?
Well, you're a journalist. I think you'd better be able to answer that, but I think paparazzi is a feature of journalism. I think it has carved itself a niche in given markets, especially as we have seemingly an obsession with celebrity in the world of today, and paparazzi have been a mechanism to deliver celebrity to us, be it by mobile, web, or newspaper.
And how does that affect the newspaper industry?
I don't think it necessarily affects it. I think there have been abuses by the paparazzi in the past, and you occasionally, you know, see it on the news, some celebrity or someone, you know, getting into a fracas, but I don't think it's necessarily affected it. The larger integrity of media and news organizations as a whole, I don't think are necessarily sort of affected by the actions of one or two paparazzi. We'll always need photos, and paparazzi serve a role on one side, but photojournalism is a vital part of journalism in general, and that's a different thing, and sometimes really they occupy a spectrum, but photojournalism, video journalism, and that side is a huge part of news media.
I wish to ask you another question which has to do with the link between commercials and checkbook journalism. You know, checkbook journalism is a practice, especially in the Anglo-Saxon media, where people pay for information in order to have exclusive monopoly for broadcast. I have not studied the commercial world. I want to know from you, especially, is that coming as an advice from the commercial department that, oh guys, we need this information, because if we have an exclusive monopoly over it, especially for the newspaper industry, whose marginal propensity is moving downward, then we are going to have some cash from it after. Is it a profitable business, checkbook journalism? It is taught in school as info journalism, but unfortunately it is practiced.
I get that. Well, in the world it is practiced, but that defies the integrity of the journalists and ultimately compromises the newspaper that might involve themselves in it. So,
but capitalism does not take that into account, because you need to make money.
Well, capitalism is a broader idea here. We're talking about the ethics of journalism, which is.
But we are operating in a capitalist system.
Yes, but capitalism, that doesn't mean that the hedge funds were allowed to collapse the American economy and so forth. So you're kind of applying what is a broad economic structure to the importance of ethical journalism. You as a journalist yourself, if I was a corporate man and asked you to plug a brand, say Coca-Cola, on your TV show, it would call into question your integrity as a journalist, and ultimately would compromise you to a point where your readership would lose interest and look elsewhere. So as a journalist, and then as a wider principal idea, as you know, that division is essential. That church and state divide between editorial and commercial is essential.
Okay, most of my Cameroonian viewers would probably like me to ask you this question. I have to put it forward. The New York Times is a giant in the communication field, let me put it that way, and you are a specialist in marketing products, packaging, branding. Now, if the government of Cameroon or South Africa or any of the Afro-Asia and Middle East countries where you operate call you to define its market policy, how to market itself, how will you elaborate it as a model?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the reality is it's different country by country. My experience, especially within the Middle East region, is the further one moves from a given country, the wider the actual, and I suppose the less the perception and real understanding of a country becomes. I can't speak for Cameroon directly at the moment because this is my 36th hour in this country.
I just need a sample, a model.
Well, we don't have a fixed model. That's the point. The key is really to understand, what you're trying to communicate, and then look at and who you're trying to communicate it to. You may have FDI objectives. You may have tourism objectives. You may have a panoply, to use your earlier word, of objectives which we would look to understand and then match up against the portfolio that we have from the commercial side. So it really depends, and every government has different goals because of the diversity in the world. So I don't think one can apply a fixed model there to the whole. What
distinction do you make of advertising in the UK and doing commercials in the United States? These are countries that you cross from time to time, the transatlantic.
Well, to be frank, I don't sell advertising in the UK or the States, but I think there are definite similarities between the consumer appetites in the UK and the US. I think, though, if you were to look at advertising that emerges from the two, there are certain differences, and I think advertisers in those individual markets look to tap the national character to some degree, and by that sort of gain leverage for their products.
Let me look at the commercial industry globally. This is something that provided the American economy at some $142 billion in 2010. That is the amount of money which was spent on advertising, and globally produced about some 476 billion as international trade. Just how profitable is it to be employed in the commercials department worldwide?
Well, I don't think I can speak to that directly. As a broader perspective, commercial advertising is a central revenue generator for any news organization, and each news organization is beholden to that revenue stream to some degree. But how profitable can it be? Well, it depends on how successful you are at selling, really, in the end.
Sure. I want to ask you a question which has to do with one of my opening questions, which has to do with the publication of classified information. When I was studying journalism, I know that I'm limited in 4 ways. That is, no journalist can attack the national security of a country and go free. No journalist can enter into the privacy of somebody and goes free. No journalist can insult and goes free. And no journalist can commit libel, or if you like, defamation, and goes free. I don't know whether the commercial departments take that into consideration, because when I see the amount of intelligence material being leaked by people like Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, through the WikiLeaks, I have the impression that this is the work of guys in the commercial department who say, okay, we need this information to go on the newspapers because we are going to sell and make money. We give a damn to that.
No, I'm afraid that's completely wrong. The reality is that the WikiLeaks articles, Edward Snowden, that information is defined under journalistic ethics as in the public interest. So what Julian Assange was able...
In the public interest, when you attack the very inner core of the national security interests of a country. Because whether you like it or not, the WikiLeaks and the Edward Snowden leaks, or if you like others, the Vati leaks, have damaged diplomatic credibility among nations and has fractured relations among countries. And professionals are still putting that on the market. And one major critic says that this is the work of guys from the commercial department because we cannot do it.
Ultimately, it doesn't need to be a commercial interest because journalists, you're a journalist yourself, are you not naturally...
And maybe the notion of public interest is quite different in the US or in the developed world and in the developing countries.
Well, I can't speak to that, but are you not as a journalist naturally curious about these things? And that natural curiosity is what drives stories like that. And unfortunately, yes, they can have a detrimental effect, but it's down to news organizations to be responsible and to look at that information that they may be gifted by someone like Snowden or Assange and use it responsibly, you know, and any news organization that doesn't is abusing their position and their platform. But ultimately, I believe that, you know, the realm of news journalism have a place for investigatory journalism. The New York Times has some fundamentally brilliant journalists who occupy that space, and as do other news organizations globally. And that will always be a central tenet of any great news brand, I think. So it's not a commercial point. Ultimately, if you're interested in it and you're a journalist and you discover a story, it is your responsibility to go after it and find it out and then decide at that point whether it's in the public interest. It's not my job as a commercial man. I won't actually ever be able to encash or develop revenue off your story. I will develop revenue off the credibility that you bring to my newspaper.
One but last question. How is life at the New York Times since Mark Thompson, the former Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, came in as Managing Director?
He's a fantastic leader and a visionary, and I look forward to working with him over the next many years. I think we're going from strength to strength.
And this question, on September 8, 2010, Arthur Zulberger Jr., chairman and publisher of the New York Times, told an international news summit in London, quote, "We will stop printing the New York Times sometime in the future." That goes back to the question I asked you about the future of the newspaper industry. When will the hard copy of New York Times go off the sales? Meaning, when will you stop doing hard copy advertorials for the New York Times?
Well, that's a very high-level strategic question, which my own position would not be able to answer directly. I suppose I can speak in a more generalist manner. I think you know, newspapers will stop printing on paper. You know, and I broadly define those two. The news will always be important
because technology is not on their side. Technology is not on the side of the hard copy.
Exactly, but my point here is you're defining the platform rather than the importance of content. The news itself is what's important. How you read it is down to your desire as the consumer. It's our job to make sure that you can get the news any way you need, be it on mobile, on iPad, on a newspaper. And I imagine in the future from now, 30 years from now, we'll be putting it on a whole array of new platforms. I don't even know what to imagine of it, but I imagine we will need to be there. And that's our responsibility as a news organization. So it isn't about the decline or removing paper news from the agenda. It's about understanding what our consumers need, what people need to read their news on.
Okay, Walter. You are my last guest of the year because next week I'm doing best of year, which according to you was the most important news item of the year.
Gosh, that's a good question. I think, well, it depends what you define as important, but I definitely thought Nelson Mandela's recent passing will be probably remembered as the signpost event of this year. I mean, he was an extraordinary man. His contribution to Africa and his example to the world was an extraordinary one, and he deserved to be remembered in the way he was. So I think for me it would have been yes, the death of Mandela.
Okay, and the way you have selected the news item, the most important of the year, encourages me to rebroadcast as best of year the program we did with the South African High Commissioner to Cameroon, Zanele Makina, immediately Nelson Mandela died as best of year. Walter Paice, the New York Times Commercial Director for the Middle East and Africa. Thanks very much for accepting to be guest on our program.
C'était bien.